So joining us today are a couple of incredible people who've really been just plotting a great course for the short-term rental discussion. Eduardo Miranda, he's the president of the Portugal Short-Term Rental Association. Shomik Panda, he's the head of the United Kingdom Short-Term Rental Association. And joining us from Porto, Portugal, a place that we should all go visit, a spectacular destination city, Ricardo Valente, a city council member there from Porto. Thank you so much for joining us, fellas.
Thank you.
So guys, you know, this is an interesting discussion to start with, because for a lot of people that are discussing this, you know, we all think this is unique to our community, but the short-term rental discussion is being had everywhere. And I would say that the discussions are very similar, whether you're in the Canary Islands or New South Wales or Niagara Falls or Atlanta, Georgia, that the situations about, you know, what are the challenges for the community and then what are the solutions? They're fairly similar in different communities. So I'm going to lead you guys through a couple of discussions. I know Eduardo, you've got a couple of slides you'd like to share with us as well. If you don't mind, I'm just going to run through a couple of questions with you first, if you don't mind, and ask you guys a little bit about how you're approaching this issue and what are the challenges. And so, council member, because you're joining us here from Porto, and again, I can't mention it enough, it's a destination we should all go visit. It's a beautiful city, and you guys have unbelievably great wine.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about how you've addressed this issue, how it came up, and just the direction that you tend to look at the short-term rental industry and creating short-term rental regulations.
Yes, Matt. First, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, talking with all of you about this subject. As you were saying, Porto right now is a world-class destination. We can say for sure that we have been nominated the best small city in the world to live by Monaco. Time Out was giving us the second spot as the most exciting city in the world between New York City and Chicago. So it's an amazing thing for us as a small city, European small city. And basically for us, tourism is a cornerstone of our strategy for economic development of the city. Since the last quarter of the last century, Porto has lost close to 30% of its residents. So we have lost a lot of population. We have watched derail all of the city center. So all of the city center was completely abandoned, and tourism was the engine for the renaissance of the city, as we say. We say that we have been as a monumental ghost city, as in the past, as a new city, as a city with life, and tourism has given us that life. So has made us conquer the city, and for that reason, Porto is, let's say, in a different scope in relation to the impact of short-term rentals, talking in the situation of Europe. So in Europe, we are watching a lot of, let's say, problems relating the connection between short-term rental and the local communities. And here in the city of Porto, we have been able to manage it, I think, very well. So we don't say short-term rental market, we say local accommodation, and this is relevant in the sense that what we are trying to say is that this new market is a market that makes the perfect combination between the local people, the local economy, and the tourism industry. So basically, this is, I think, the best connection between looking at the city tourism industry, not be closed in a resort style, in big hotels, but directly in the community, going in different neighbors of the city. So it's able to give life to a different kind of destinations in the city. So talking about regulations, and Eduardo can talk a little bit about that, about the local framework here in Portugal. I think that Portugal is a case study all over the world, I think, for sure. we have been one of the first countries to regulate this industry, and we call it industry. This is relevant. So people look at this local accommodation as a business. And so we don't face the normal problems that we have all over Europe, like tax evasions, all of that kind of thing. So we have a local, national regulation with a very close registration system. And on the local community, what we have is that we micromanage the impact of this market in the territory. So, the central government has given the cities the ability to put in places regulations so that they can manage the pressure of the growth of this market, as we have seen that it has grown exponentially in the last years. And we know for sure that every kind of market that grows at this growth rate is very difficult to tackle it. I think that the problem when we want to put in place a lot of restrictions is that you are trying to manage something that you don't know what is the ultimate outcome of the thing. So you should do it gradually. That is our let's say main message here in the city of Porto. We are very liberal in the sense that we are firm believers on regulations, but we think that the regulation should be made properly. So a very strict regulation, I think, is bad for this kind of businesses.
That's what a great way to put it. Firm believers in regulations, but the regulations should work. I mean, they should achieve compliance. They should make sense. And to take that gradual approach that you mentioned, we feel like so many cities that we study, when we do the different analyses, whether economic or housing or the compliance success of different cities, where they fail is, I feel like, where they tried to move too far, too quickly without understanding the industry. That's great. So, Eduardo, this is probably a great time to pivot to you and just to keep this on Portugal for a few moments, if you don't mind. Let me just start with just asking you, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your view of, what works, what creates success for short-term rental regulations.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for the invitation. Hi, everyone. Well, first of all, I'm the president of the Portuguese Association. As Ricardo said, we don't like us to be called short-term rental. We call it local accommodation. And that's very important because we don't consider us in the rental real estate business, although it's part of the business, but we consider us in the touristic accommodation service. And that's the way we like to be recognized. I'm also a short-term rental, local accommodation manager. And so I'm also involved in the process. Talking about regulation, I think Portugal has a very interesting experience. We have a regulation, national regulation since 2008. I don't want to get too much in detail, but I think it's important to understand how you frame the short-term rental in the regulation, because there are different layers. And I think some of the problems that we have is that in the other cities is becoming a reactive regulation, meaning that when you have the conflict, when you have the pressure, you start regulating, but already in a public opinion ambient that is very difficult to regulate well. And also it's a local regulation and you don't have the big frame. I would just put a brief here slide just to show how in Portugal this works. I don't know if you can see. The layers that we work on is basically, number one is tax layers. The first thing that any government wants is to tax to get the money, if you see in an industry is coming. So for example, here in our tax system, we are considered touristic service. We are not rentals, no? And we pay IRS the way everyone pays, no? Then you have the very other important that I think it's missing in many countries. That is the regulation of the activity itself. This here is done in a national way, could be in a regional, in a state way, but it's important to assume and to consider short-term rental as part of the touristic industry. That's why we call it local accommodation. We are officially part of the touristic industry. And in this national law, we have all the requirements, meaning that For example, fire extinctors, blankets, everything that has to do with safety, sending information for the foreign borders of who's in our house. There's no difference, for example, between peers and professional, because in some way, everyone has to be a professional when you're dealing with tourism. No, so we are, and we have also the registration system. One of the first and most, it's a key factor. This is a free online registration system, nationally available for everyone. So with this system, we are not only able to know what's going on, and that brings a lot of things, that's data, and also getting everyone legal and being able to see who is legal and who is not legal, because part of the sustainability is also being fair play, being everyone in the fair play means legal. This registration number, for example, is obligatory to put in the advertisements. No? And what I believe is that we are in a change, and then we have the question of the cities, how the cities, as Ricardo said, deal when you have a pressure situation. And the way they found here was not the perfect way, but it's, I think it's something that is a step on, is, okay, the cities can regulate, but they have to respect the national law, meaning that they can regulate when there is local pressure in a neighborhood. They can regulate, restrict the quantity, the amount of growth, but the requirements are national, because this is part of the tourism. Because if you let each city defines what short-term rental or local accommodation is, in the end of the day, you don't have a touristic product, because in one city it's just in rooms, the other city is the entire home, the other city is just 60 days, the other city is only professional. Now here, they put it all, they made a product, and probably that's one of the reasons why Portugal, Lisbon and Porto got so many awards in the last 4 or 5 years. Because we brought diversity to tourism. It's a change, it's a new trend. And if the cities don't see that this is a huge opportunity, if they only see the negative impacts, there is no way to regulate well. So the first thing is to have a look is if you believe there is a potential in short-term rental, and then see how you can deal with that. No? And we can talk later, but I think we have to change the regulation scheme or the regulation paradigm. We are still using the restriction prohibition, the reactive regulation, and then we have to change to a proactive regulation, that it's a smart regulation where we monitor, we have data, and then we try to avoid the conflict, avoid the pressure, and redirect the growth of short-term rental to sustainability, and not wait until it gets a certain point that we have to prohibit. I think that's the key factor here. It's anticipate.
That's great. You know, it's so nice to hear a government policy maker and then a manager of short-term rentals that have worked together to find solutions. Eduardo, you've been at this for a few years now, helping to organize the Portuguese Association. Would you say that getting people to understand the importance of engaging with local government regulators, is that an important leap that helps the local governments be successful in creating good regulations?
I think absolutely, because this is a question of survival, and especially the property managers, the private owners, the individual private owners, they have to understand that we are growing in a community, and if we don't care of each other, if we don't see the other side, if we don't work together, the activity is going to be compromised. So I think now they're realizing that here, for example, in this COVID crisis, it has been extremely important to have an association, to have an official activity industry here, because we are trying to negotiate support the same way as any other industry does. And if we didn't exist as an official industry, as an association, this would be impossible at this moment, this very critical moment.
Yeah. You know, you guys have done a remarkable job. So you should be very happy. You certainly have done a great job of engaging with your policymakers and helping them to understand the importance of this issue. So Shomik, Panda, my friend in the United Kingdom, you've worked on this in the UK, but also Europe-wide, I mean, throughout Europe. So you certainly have a strong understanding of the regulations across Europe. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned over all these years.
Sure, thanks, Matt, and great to see you all. Thank you for having me. It was really nice to also hear from Eduardo and Ricardo about the great Portuguese example, because I think there's a lot we can learn from how well Portugal has done this. In particular, just having the importance of clear regulations so that, you know, everybody, all actors, industry and hosts are able to comply easily. And I think that's something that Portugal seems to have done very well, in particular with its registration scheme being quite simple and online, easy, no big barriers to access. And, you know, I think as I look at other registration schemes and that kind of thing popping up across Europe, these are a good example of how governments can quickly achieve compliance, capture data that they want and need to be able to then, you know, regulate appropriately in the future. So great lesson there. Yeah, I mean, in terms of Europe, generally, I think what we're seeing is there's lots of different layers of regulatory activity. The European Union, even today, has launched some new regulations, the Digital Services Act, which will look to put some new regulations in place across the whole of Europe that, in particular, sort of accommodation platforms will have to deal with. That's more around, you know, making sure that properties that are being listed are legal, and if they're illegal, the accommodation platforms will have a responsibility to take them down. They also have to verify their business users, you know, submit these kind of transparency reports, and also it will give the power to national authorities and local authorities to ask platforms for, you know, to ask platforms to require hosts to give information from time to time, such as, for instance, if they want to get information on an individual's tax situation and how much income they have earned on the platform, they will start be given those powers to actually ask platforms those questions, and platforms will have to give them back. And it's the beginning of some sort of cross-European system whereby regulators will also be able to talk to each other. So if a listing has had to be taken down in one area, then, you know, the regulators will talk to the regulators in other countries, and they will also make sure that that listing will not pop up in a different jurisdiction. So on the one level, you have these very big cross-cutting initiatives at EU level, and then at national level, as Eduardo mentioned, you can have these national frameworks that might be setting day limits, for instance, or you know, 60-day limits, 90-day limits, zoning requirements, that sort of thing. And in countries like Spain, Portugal, there's an additional local element as well as state and beyond. And what we have found, I think, if there's one thing I would share with you today, I think as an association in the UK, what have we tried to do as this industry has matured to help government, is we've tried to really think about what voluntary kind of initiatives or co-regulatory initiatives are there that we can work with government to actually address some of the concerns they have at a local level. And I think as your session is called Best Practice International, instead of me focusing on some of the best practice regulations, I thought it'd be interesting just to talk about some of the best practice voluntary initiatives that we have put forward in the UK this year, because I think they might be a bit more new and different. And in the context of COVID, which has been such a challenge for our industry this year, the first thing that the UK Association is quite proud to have achieved this year is that we worked with the UK government to launch a program called NHS Homes. For those of you, it's a global audience who don't know the NHS, it's the National Health Service in the UK, which essentially was a collaboration of property managers in the UK and platforms all coming together, offering their accommodation to key workers who are working in the healthcare industry and other employees of the NHS, so that they were able to stay on a not-for-profit basis during the COVID crisis and take advantage of this accommodation stock that we have as an industry. And that was a really successful program that worked in the first wave of COVID, which I think I have some numbers here, which hosted 10,000 nights for free across 1,500 homes in the UK. That's £20 million worth of stays for the UK government, assisting 50 different health authorities, which was a wonderful thing to do at the time of crisis. But, you know, once that initial emergency situation finished, we thought, okay, what can we do beyond this? And that program has now rolled on so that to something that we are now calling Trusted Stays, which is the next stage of this program. And that the aim of this Trusted Stays program is to come up with a platform for government, local authorities, health authorities, corporate travel agencies, to be able to source discounted accommodation for staff in a way that meets their needs in the COVID world going forward. So this kind of great example of government and private sector collaboration there that I think has, will last well beyond the crisis, because and it's really brought the short-term rental accommodation stock to the government in a way that it hasn't in the UK. It hasn't been there before. It was, normally sort of hotel accommodation stock that the government was always using, and now this whole new type of stock has been made available to them, which is great for our industry and great for the government. Another initiative that we have worked on is around education. So this is at a much more targeted local level with some local authorities. And we launched in the UK with Westminster Council something called the Considerate Lettings Charter, which is essentially a charter of best practice, which talks about all the do's and don'ts of short lettings, both legal obligations in the UK, but also beyond that, what are the do's and don'ts of short letting from a host perspective. So just dealing with your neighbors in the right way, what's the respectful sort of things that you should be doing about rubbish collection and et cetera, et cetera. And in collaboration with Westminster Council, that charter got mail shot out regularly and continues to get mail shot out regularly to all Westminster residents. So those who are short letting without a property manager, as well as those with property managers, really understand not just their legal obligations, but going beyond what they should be doing just to be a good resident and a good neighbor. So there are two examples. We're also launched proudly, finally, because I know you want to move on to the next person, Matt, but the last thing we've done is launch an accreditation scheme in the UK, which I think is one of the first internationally. And that's really about trying to ensure a basic level of quality and of safety, which we have done with a third-party operator, which is totally independent from us, called Quality in Tourism. So now hosts in the UK have an opportunity to get this accreditation, and property managers too can also get their stock accredited, so that whenever they are listing their properties, if they have got this, if they meet the thresholds for accreditation, they are able to put that plaque of trust onto their listings. And we're really looking to grow this now across the UK, so that we have essentially created something which has driven the standards of the accommodation stock in the UK upwards to a point that is well beyond safe, clean and legal, but at least at a minimum is that. I think with that, Matt, I'll pass back to you. Just wanted to give you a few of those.
No, that's incredible. What a great tale to tell. And I think that it goes to show what we heard from Ricardo and what we heard from Eduardo really tees up to this part of the conversation, which is if you allow the engagement of the stakeholders to occur, then you can learn more about the industry, and you could probably get a lot of voluntary compliance coming from industry, from the active participants in the in short-term stays and short-term rentals, or in home accommodations. You can get that participation into a program and the creation of the program from those operators themselves, the managers and the hosts. I'd be remiss to not mention in the United States, I'm sure a lot of ears perked up when you mentioned the accreditation program that you have in the UK. So many of the listeners today are from the United States. The Vacation Rental Management Association, the VRMA, which I'm a former board member of, to be transparent, and certainly try to always weave into any collaborative discussions. They do have an accreditation program as well. And I do think that's a very interesting element to place on professional property managers and operators, to make sure that they understand those basics of how to be a good operator, so that the travelers coming to your community have a great experience. Those are some great learnings from the UK, and I really appreciate that. So just jumping back a little bit and back to Ricardo and Eduardo, one of the interesting things that I feel like has dominated this discussion is a lack of awareness by the operators of short-term rentals, of home accommodations. that they don't always know about the rules that are in place where they need to be following local rules. Do you see that as a challenge in Portugal? And I'll start with you, Ricardo.
Let's say, I don't think so. I think, let's say, I think that the rules are very simple. Let's say, so most of our problems are problems connected, let's say, to the way the growth of this kind of product has been in place for the last few years. So I think that most of our problems are connected to that. Okay, so the rules are very simple. We invest a lot of time talking to all of the stakeholders. So we talk with the associations, the national associations. We have talked with the platforms. So we have talked to Booking. We have talked to Airbnb. We have put in place an agreement with Airbnb. So our framework is to make cooperation. So it's talk to people, to understand the problems and try to resolve them. I think that most of the challenges, again, that we have in this kind of thing, is the connection between the sustainability of this industry and the sustainabilities of the cities. So how can we mix this together so that this could be a win-win situation? And I think this is the most relevant, let's say, challenge that we face. I think that the directive in Europe, as we see it, putting the simple rule, and the rule will be what is illegal offline should be illegal online. So this is a very simple rule, but a very strong one. I think that most of your problems are ended on that basis. I think that, let's say, most of the problems in Europe, I don't like to talk about this because it's not politically correct, is that in a lot of countries, the rules are completely stupid, let's say.
Right.
And that's the problem. If you have a rule that is completely no sense, if the rule is completely impossible to comply with, if you don't have any means of supervision for that rule, you cannot put all of the costs on the private sector. So you cannot put the costs on Airbnb and Booking so that they can give you everything that you need to comply with the rule. So the problem is with the rule. And for us, this is something relevant because I think that, again, Porto, Lisbon, and Algarve and Portugal in a broader sense, I think that they can teach how to manage this and how to mix this together, putting very simple rules, rules that are easy to understand, easy to comply with, and easy to make supervision of, so that you can enforce easily that kind of rules. So I think that's the main message. Put it simple, so that you don't kill this new industry, and then try to put people together. Okay, so that's the basis of this. So that you put all of the stakeholders talking together. And again, here in the city of Porto, we have made the Council of Tourism for the city, and we have put together the association of the local accommodation guys and all of the stakeholders in the city, so that we can talk and resolve together all of the challenges that we have. Because when you are running a city, of course, you are running conflicts. So you are managing conflicts again and again. So it's normal to have that kind of conflicts. And I think that the basis is that you put people together and you make let's say, a bottom-up approach, so that in the end, the regulation is a regulation that is the maximum common denominator of all of the people that are involved on this industry.
Right. So Ricardo made a great point about creating a win-win, and that you can have a win-win, a healthy community that has the robust tourism economy that includes local accommodations. It sounds like you've seen a lot of win-wins in Portugal, throughout Portugal. For me, when we study this, and we've been studying this issue now for 10 years and looking at different regulations that work and trying to help governments and travel industry leaders create good regulations that achieve compliance, it seems that the biggest challenge is trying to convince a policymaker that there is a win-win, that you can allow local accommodations in a community to some degree. Would you find that to be the biggest hurdle that you have in Portugal, is convincing some council members, some elected officials, that a win-win exists?
Well, I think first of all, let's give a realistic. We don't want to give a paradise view here. We also have in the cities here in Lisbon and in Porto, we also have the same housing problems, and there is also some of these tents. The question is, how do we solve it? And the easiest way is just prohibition, saying no. It's the easiest way. That's the no way. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing in many cities. Here, we try to solve this with dialogue. And I think that's the first step. If you realize that this is an important potential thing for tourism, then you try to sort out solutions. The problem is that in most of the cities, what we see is that the question is addressed already in a very, very high ambient, and it gets very political, especially during local elections. And at this moment, usually, there is very little space for dialogue. And I think that's the first step. In some areas where we see, especially talking of international friends, is that there is no openness to dialogue from policymaker, and then there is no way of finding a midterm solution. So fortunately here, we may not agree with many things, we may have tensions, there is also, but at least there is dialogue. And with dialogue, we can try to find out a midway. For example, in Lisbon, we are first one to admit that in certain neighborhoods, the balance between tourism and the inhabitants could be a little bit compromised, and that's not a sustainable thing for the future. So we were the first one to give a support, a relatory, a report saying what we think is an objective way of measuring this stress. Because the biggest problem is that when you make decisions based only on public opinion, and it's in the last minute just to solve an election problem, you lose stability. And if you don't give a stable ambient for the the first speech we had, if you don't give a stable ambient, nobody's going to invest on that. Nobody's going to dedicate on that. So the problem here is taking a little bit the discussion out of this very hot political ambient and trying to bring a little bit of facts in this discussion. Data is very important, and I think the registration system with the data we manage, I know politicians usually are not based on data-driven facts, but if you don't have facts, they cannot create another narrative for that. So we need these facts to know what's going on in the reality. After that, you have the dialogue, then you can create beautiful things. Like, for example, we made the same program here with the government, supported by the government. We received 600 doctors, nurses during the COVID first months for free. And the electricity and the water was paid by the public tourist board. For example, tomorrow I'm having a meeting with the Ministry of Education, and they want to see how we can work together to put part of this offer, this accommodation, available to students, for example. And so when you start this dialogue, even the most difficult things, at least you try to find a way out.
You know, beginning the dialogue is just so important. And I think you just hit the nail on the head several times. Having that discussion and bringing the right players into the discussion, having that community engagement is what helps you be successful. And it's clearly helped you to be successful throughout Portugal. So Shomik, to end up with you, you've been working on this issue as long as I have. I mean, it's been 10 long years of looking at this issue throughout Europe. And then your work in the UK, you're the #1 consultant in Europe on the short-term rental regulatory issue and other new emerging technology issues. Tell us a little bit about where this goes from here. I mean, I feel like early on the concern was the instant growth of the activity through the success of sites like Airbnb and Booking.com. That created some reactions related to a variety of things like noise, parking, trash, and occupancy, and other community concerns. What happens next? Have people realized that this industry is here to stay, and are we going to see the excited level of regulatory creation? Is it going to slow down and even out?
Thanks, Matt. Great question. I suspect that, obviously COVID has changed things to some degree as well. And in that I think, right now the industry has had a really difficult time this last year. And you'd expect that certain things that governments may have been thinking of doing pre-crisis will be at least delayed and probably examined in a bit more detail and introduced at a more, more appropriate times. Once the industry has sort of picked itself up a little bit, and that's at least the hope. Having said that, we have a good example like just last week where in Scotland they have decided, or this week they're going to lay some new regulations that they've been thinking about for a long time, which will be quite restrictive, new licensing schemes and control zone areas. And they have decided not to delay this legislation despite the economic situation that's happening, which I think is really quite disappointing for the industry, because there are a number of accommodation providers that are on their knees right now, and this may be the final blow for them. So, but notwithstanding, bigger picture, as you asked me, I think that we will still see quite a few more iterations of short-lets regulations. I think right across Europe. Most of the countries and most at national level have done 1 or 2 iterations. Some have done a third, but I think a lot of them still are at the phase that Eduardo said. They're still gathering the data, and until they have seen exactly what the data does, or when they realize what the data has done, they will have to revise again, and I think it's an iterative process. So I expect perhaps a little pause in the next year or two while things pick up again, and then after that, I think that it'll be time to revisit these regulatory frameworks and to try and improve them and make them as efficient and effective as possible.
And you mentioned the data. Is having good, clear data a helpful thing to these discussions? It seems like these discussions are often so anecdotal driven. But if you have data, then you're able to show that this is a different type of travel accommodation for a different type of traveler, and you can show the success of regulations. Do you find that having better data helps your discussions with policymakers?
Absolutely, and I think we have to have some sympathy for the policymakers that they have had to try and make policy without this data up to this point, and where there have been, some clear isolated problems that needed dealing and some base level regulation that was always going to be necessary. So even though we often can accuse them of not fantastic regulation, it's easy to say that in hindsight, but they are having to work with a difficult situation where they cannot see everything. And for that reason, I think we have all come around, or we're slowly coming around also to the point about registration. As a first step, this does seem to be a very good measure to at least pick up that information. But that should be the first step, I think, and then you can then decide what is appropriate, because what's appropriate in touristy destinations on the coast can often be so different to what is appropriate in an urban area. And up to this point, that kind of that sort of nuance has not necessarily always been there, because policymakers have been forced not to, or simply haven't had the data. So let's take that first step. Let's gather the data, and then I think let's regulate the right way.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to wind this down. For everybody listening today, I can't say it enough. We said at the beginning of the conversation, we would much rather be live and in person. Nobody wants to watch more Zoom conferences, but we do need to get this education, and we do need to have these discussions. So thank you for tuning in.